Our next session is going to be on water regulations relevant to New Jersey. For those of you who are not familiar with some of the federal and state water regulations, and I will let Sal introduce himself.
Thank you, Melissa. There we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Sal Mangiafico. I work for Rutgers Cooperative Extension, primarily in Cumberland and Salem counties, often in water resources. There's me and my natural aquatic habitat. So I'll be talking about water regulations, in particular, water use for agricultural purposes in the state. But I thought I'd start off with something fun, at least what I think of as fun. We'll talk a little bit about water supply in general in New Jersey. So the information I'll be presenting here is from, in these first slides, is from the 2017 Water Supply Master Plan. So the state puts out a water supply master plan. I think it lasts for 6 years, and they're working on the 2023 plan right now, but that's not out yet. So I have information from the 2017 plan. And there's a link it's publicly available. The link's here if you want to take a look at that plan yourself. In your Canvas module, my presentation's there. All the links should be usable to get to any of the information I'm talking about. So just to give you a sense of what the state's thinking about when they're thinking about water supply. We're concerned with traditional use of water, right? Residential use, commercial use, agricultural use, but also balancing that with ecological uses. So of course, in the summer, when everyone's irrigating and everyone's watering their lawn and filling their pools, we don't want streams to go dry. And then there's a lot of other considerations that come in, considerations of environmental justice, infrastructure, regulations, and so on. And so that's all kind of in this plan addressed. Here, I'll just kind of highlight the second bullet point I have there, which is that a lot of this plan works on smaller watershed scales, what they call the Huck 11 scale. There's 151 in the state. That gives you, and I'll have some maps here too, gives you some sense of kind of the granularity at which they look at some of these water use issues. So kind of the summary of that 2017 water supply plan, their conclusions are that New Jersey has ample rainfall, groundwater storage and reservoirs, provided we increase efficiency and conservation, do public education and outreach, address deteriorating infrastructure, work on storage, treatment, and distribution, having some larger water projects, as well as funding, monitoring, and assessment. Right, so the basic point is, in New Jersey, we are blessed by having ample rainfall. We also have 9 million or so people, as well as lots of agriculture, industry. So we use a lot of water. We have a lot of water. We use a lot of water. The state is always thinking ahead and trying to plan for balancing those uses that I mentioned earlier. The uses we have for water and also the ecological importance of it. So I'll present, again, this is the fun part, at least from my point of view. I'll present a few slides of some graphs and such. So here across the x-axis, we have years going from 1990 to 2015. And this is just where we get the water from. So the dark blue bars are surface water. So that could be things like rivers and streams, but also in a lot of cases, human-made impoundments like drinking water reservoirs. And then those lighter blue bars are groundwater, either confined or unconfined aquifers. So I think kind of the upshot here is that on a statewide basis, we get a lot of our water from those surface water reservoirs, but a considerable amount also from groundwater sources. If we start to look at the industries that use water, or sort of the sectors that use water, those gray bars are, again, the years are across the x-axis. The gray bars are power generation, the blue bars are potable water, and then in green you have agriculture. So you can see that looking at overall how much water we use across the state, and this is fairly consistent across the years, a lot of the water we use is for potable uses, and then also power generation and industrial uses or commercial uses. And agriculture makes up a fairly small portion of that water. What's also kind of notable here is that if you look in the last years that are presented here, say going from 2005 to 2015, the overall amount of water we're using in the state is actually decreasing. This is the same kind of plot with the same colors, except instead of years across the x-axis, we have months across the x-axis. So again, it's notable that the potable use is the majority of the water that we use, and the agricultural use is a smaller proportion. But I think what's also interesting here is you get to see the seasonal variation in that. So if you look in the summer months, which are in the middle of the graph, say from May to September, overall water use is higher. It's higher for agriculture, which makes sense. People are irrigating more in those summer months. But also the potable water supplies go up in the summer as well. And so we can imagine that may have to do with people irrigating their lawns, which they're using a potable water supply, irrigating their lawns, maybe filling swimming pools and so on. So it's important to think that in the summer months, we're using more water for agricultural irrigation, we're using more water for households, for potable use. And then also in the summer is when we may be more concerned with the ecological need for water, right? So everything's happening in the summer. It's hotter, it's drier, people are irrigating more, they're using more water, and also that has a higher potential for streams to, say, dry up in those months. This plot is similar. It breaks down non-consumptive use and consumptive use. And so just quickly, again, this is the way the state is looking at these water issues. Non-consumptive use is something where the water gets used, but it gets returned essentially to the same watershed. So the case I like to think about is if you have a house in, say, a rural area where they have a well, they're pumping water, let's say they're using the shower, that water goes down the drain and out to a septic system. That water gets used, it gets withdrawn from the aquifer, but it doesn't really go anywhere. It's not consumed up. It's going right back into the ground. Whereas consumptive use is something where that water kind of is used and more or less disappears. So if we're doing irrigation properly, most of that is consumptive use. You're irrigating a crop or even your lawn, say, and that water is taken up by those plants, transpired into the atmosphere, and then it's not being returned to that watershed. Now, it may come back another day as rain or whatever, but that's consumptive use. It's basically being used and it's disappearing from our water sources for, say, that watershed. And you can see the way the graph looks here. You see those orange spikes basically every year, and those are the summer uses, where that consumptive water use really jumps up, again, through irrigation, whether it's agricultural irrigation, irrigating lawns, gardens, and other uses like, say, filling swimming pools. So in this plot, so all those I mentioned those Huck 11 watersheds earlier on. So all of those are outlined in black on these maps. So it gives you some sense that they're looking at when they're looking at water resources, they're looking at a relatively small scale area that they're thinking about. So if we just look at the right-hand graph, now they've changed the colors on us. In this case, yellow is agriculture, blue is potable. And on that right-hand graph, it's the primary use for each of those smaller watersheds at peak use rates. So the yellow ones are where agriculture is the primary consumptive use of water in those watersheds. So you can see, say, in the more or less in the southern part of the state, there's a lot of these watersheds where agriculture's the largest consumptive use of water. And then the blue, throughout the state where it's more populated, the potable water uses are the main consumptive use. Again, looking at the right-hand map, this is a similar plot or similar data. In this case, it's drawn for full allocation use. So the state gives water allocation to, say, any municipalities that have water systems, to farms, to larger commercial, industrial operations. And this is looking at if all those users actually use their full amount of allocation for water, what would be the primary consumptive use of those? And in this case, those sub-watersheds that have agricultural use as their primary use of consumptive water, there's a few more of them. And so some of the issue here, looking at the difference between those maps, is that not everyone uses their full allocation, of course. And so, if any of those users is given a certain allocation to use in, say, a given year, chances are they're not going to use all that allocation. And agriculture is a prime example of that. And so here, this plot is just looking at the difference between the allocation for agricultural use and the amount that's reported being used for agricultural use. Again, across the state, and this is on the x-axis across years going from 2008 to 2015. So the allocation is drawn in those blue bars, the reported use is in those orange bars, and then that gray line matches to the y-axis on the right side, which is the percent of the allocation that's used. So basically, if we look at the gray line, it's somewhere around 30% across years, somewhat consistently. So basically, what we're looking at here is that on average, agriculture farms only use, say, about 30% of their allocation in a given year. So this is just something that, for those at the state level that are looking at water resources, this is something of interest, that we're allowing farms a certain allocation water use. And typically, overall across the state, averaged out, farms are only using, say, 30% of that. And just some data that's not published, but looking at some of the counties that have the highest amount of water use going towards agriculture: Salem, Cumberland, Atlantic, Burlington, and some others, where a significant amount of their water use is in agriculture. Okay, so that was the fun stuff. Now we'll jump into some of the regulations for using water for agricultural use. One thing that's important to understand is, from a regulatory standpoint in the state, the ability to have water, to pump water, to use water, doesn't give you the right to use that water. So you can, just because you have a stream running through your property and you could put a pump on it and use that water for irrigation, doesn't mean you have the right to use that water for irrigation. Likewise, you can sink a well and pump so much water, but that doesn't give you the right, in terms of regulation, to use that water for irrigation. Essentially, if you're able to use a certain amount of water for irrigation, it kicks in a regulation with the need for an agricultural water usage certification or an agricultural water use registration. And these concern irrigation uses in agriculture. Potable water is a sort of a whole separate question, and I'll just touch on that a tiny bit later. But mainly in this talk, we're talking about irrigation uses of water. So there's those two levels of regulatory requirements, the certifications and the registrations. Essentially, they both kick in when someone has the ability to divert 100,000 gallons of water per day, again, for agricultural use. And that comes out to 70 gallons per minute. So basically, if you have wells on your property or intakes on surface water sources that together for agricultural use can pump 70 gallons per minute or more, then these the certification or the registration becomes required by the state. The DEP has a fairly useful website listed here that describes these, that has forms, that has a lot of information. So that's a useful site to go to look for the details on this. So the difference between those water usage certifications and registrations, as I said, they both kick in at that 70 gallon per minute level. But registrations are for cases where the allocation that's requested is less than, it's basically less than that amount, which is 3 million gallons per month. And just to give you a rough idea of what that means, it's something like if you're irrigating crops, it might be something like 13 acres of irrigated crops. Certifications are for cases where the allocation is more than that amount, that 3 million gallons per month. So essentially, farms that are irrigating crops, irrigating an area of crop that's 13 acres or more are going to be in the certification tier of regulation. The enabling regulation for this is New Jersey Administrative Code 720A. Again, there's the link, and this document is a little lengthy, but it's very readable. So if you're looking to understand kind of all the pieces of this regulation, it's fairly accessible to go there and to read through it. Some of the relevant state agencies that deal with these regulations, specifically for the water use certifications and registrations, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection is really the primary agency that deals with this. Rutgers Cooperative Extension also is a part of this process. So it's actually written into the enabling regulations that Rutgers Cooperative Extension is part of this. And essentially, it's the agricultural agent in the county. So you know that each county has a cooperative extension office, and there's a county agent there that is responsible for working with this program, working with farmers in the state for this program. It's slightly complicated, the role of Rutgers Cooperative Extension in this, simply because there was a court case in 2009 where the Superior Court of New Jersey interpreted the law in a way that identifies Rutgers Extension as being the issuing entity, as they say, for these certifications. Practically speaking, DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, is really the regulating agency. And practically speaking, Rutgers Cooperative Extension helps with, well, one is that they do a calculation for the allocation based on the acreage and the crops being grown, what's a reasonable allocation for that farm, and then also assisting farmers with completing that paperwork correctly. Also, the New Jersey Department of Agriculture is involved indirectly, specifically the Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Basically, they participate in the water use certification program, as well as the water supply master plan that I mentioned earlier. So they're kind of an integral part of the planning process in all these. There is a application. So if a farm needs this water certification or registration, usually their first step is to go to their county extension office and work with them in order to fill out this application for the registration or certification. Again, there's a link for the website where this form is found, as well as some other instructions and information. I won't go through this in detail, but there's a fair amount of information requested for this. Things like the owner and the operator, information on them, blocks and lots, acreage, crop, soil type is also requested there. And then a list of the diversion sources. And diversion source is simply a well or the pump that's located on a surface water body. So the application is tied directly to those certain wells or to those pumps on the, say, pond or stream or lake or river. There's that calculation I mentioned that's done by Rutgers Cooperative Extension based on the acreage and the crop. There's amount of water allocation requested, and that's done both on the maximum amount in any given month and on a total for the year. Also a map of the diversion sources, that is again the wells or the intakes, where those are, and the description of the irrigation that's used. So for example, if there's center pivots, if drip irrigation is used, and so on. One thing to note is that the certification needs to be kept current. And basically the state breaks up any modifications to that certification or registration into minor modifications and major modifications. And these are spelled out in that administrative code that I mentioned earlier. So again, you can read through that if you want the details on each of these. But major modifications are things like moving an intake, adding a diversion source, that is adding a well or another pump on a surface water body, requesting an increase in allocation. So for example, if you're changing crops on your farm or putting more land into production, the amount of water needed to do that may increase. Or an increase in the pumping capacity in terms of gallons per minute. So if you were to, switch out a pump for another pump that has a higher gallons per minute rating on it, you would need to do a modification for that. And then there's just some minor modifications. If there's a change of address or name, transfer of ownership of the operation, replacing a well, and replacing in this case means something in the same location, same depth, same capacity. So it's basically swapping out one well for an identical well. And there's a bunch of other things. The point there being just that the state expects farmers to keep those keep the certification paperwork up to date with any changes that go on. If it does rise to the level of a certification as opposed to a registration, then those are renewed every 5 years. It's kind of a similar process where the state would send you notification that it's time to renew it, and then you would go into the cooperative extension office and set up an appointment there in order to get that paperwork completed in the correct manner. All right, so a quick sidebar on potable water. I won't discuss potable water much, but as I mentioned, we've been discussing irrigation use of water on farm. Potable water is sort of a whole separate question. The state does think about potable water quote unquote systems, they fall into 3 categories. And so I think in their lingo, everything's a system. Any potable water source that's used for potable water is a system. So there's non-public, public community, public non-community. So basically, and there's stipulations for each of these, and of course the regulations change on each of these. And so the specifics of how that potable water is being used and where depends on how it's regulated, basically. Often if you have farms with workers, these distinctions become important depending on how many workers are there, if they're seasonal, not seasonal, if there's housing for workers, if there's a drinking water system there. All these things come into play. There's potentially several different regulatory agencies that can come into play with potable water. Primarily for farms that have worker housing and a lot of workers, the New Jersey Department of Labor will be a primary regulating agency. But also there's, again, NJDEP, county health departments, and then the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs comes into play, often if there's complaints about a water system. Another quick sidebar, well permitting. Basically, the way this works is that the well driller applies for a permit from the state in order to put in a well. So the first step from a farm standpoint is to contact a well driller. In the first piece of paperwork that's important sort of to keep your hands on when you get it is the well drilling permit. So this is the first sort of step of it. And this has the approximate location, depth of the well that they intend to drill, the use in terms of if it's irrigation, an irrigation well, and the expected rate in terms of gallons per minute that well will be used for. And so what happens here, this gives enough information for the state to understand what aquifer is being tapped into and how much water will probably be drawn out of that. So they can look at that in terms of the water sources that are available in that aquifer in that region in order to approve that well drilling permit. When the well's all done, there's another piece of paperwork that comes back, which is the well record. And this has a little more information. And it's done after the well's already in. So it has like the exact location of the well, the depth, some of the geological information when they were drilling the well, and then the rate at which the pump that they put in draws in terms of gallons per minute. The upshot here is that this paperwork can be important to hang on to as it is used in that certification or registration process. Just a couple notes on wells. Irrigation wells and potable water wells are constructed differently and they have different specifications. So if a well's put in for irrigation purposes, it's not the case usually that well can just be switched over to potable water use. Even if the water's good, even if it's the same source that, you're tapping into the same aquifer that you would for a potable water well, the construction of the wells is different. So that you can't just switch over from an irrigation well to a potable water well. Any abandoned or malfunctioning wells either need to be fixed, the problems need to be addressed, or they need to be decommissioned. And this is also reported to the state in terms of that registration and certification process. For older wells in particular, or when paperwork is missing, it's possible to do a well search with as much information as you have for the state to be able to kind of dig up that older paperwork. So if there's an old well on a farm where there's not paperwork and say the new owner wants to use that well and add it to their certification or registration, they're going to need the information from that well paperwork in order to add it. So it's possible for the state to go and search for that paperwork, given whatever information you have for them to work with. Another quick sidebar, water quality. The quality of the water that you're using for an agricultural use is important. And it's important for, say, irrigation, obviously if it's potable water, if it's being used to water livestock, as mentioned earlier, if it's used to irrigate crops in terms of food safety concerns. And the parameters that are of interest for any of these uses varies. So it's important if you're going to get a water test to know what you're using the water for, and then to follow the best recommendations for what parameters to test for and what the acceptable limits are for those parameters. Just going to skip over this. I put in some slides about the agricultural water use certification that comes back as a permit. Basically, it's a fairly detailed document, and it is tied to the water use. It's tied to those specific diversion sources. So, you know, the specific wells, the specific pumps that are on surface water. It's also tied to the amount of gallons per minute that can be pumped from those sources, the amount in terms of the allocation, the amount that can be used per month, per year. This permit also requires reporting the water use, which is done annually, but the water use needs to be kept track of per month. So you keep track of how much you use from each source every month, and then at the end of the year, you report it all to the state. And there's lots of other requirements in that document in terms of a lot of those modifications we mentioned. If any of those, if there's a need to modify it, part of the permit is that you go ahead and alert the state that the permit needs to be modified. And I'll just end by mentioning at the end of the presentation, I had a couple of just useful websites. One I like a lot is NJ Map 2. In there, there's something called Parcel Explorer. And this is real useful to look up blocks and lots of specific parcels. Then it gives you a lot of information in terms of the owners, the taxes paid, the last time it was sold, how much it was sold for, if it's a qualified farm. A lot of other information that's real useful when you're researching either your own property or maybe property you're interested in buying, something like that. Sort of a similar website is NJDEP's GeoWeb. One thing that's nice about that is it has a function where you can search the way that they map wells, which their location is given in X and Y feet in the New Jersey system. So you can find exactly where the well is if you have that well paperwork that has those coordinates on it. And finally, if you want to know a little bit about the soils on your farm, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service has their soil surveys now. The most up-to-date ones are on the web. This tool is a little interesting to use, but gives you lots of information about the soils that you can expect to find on your property. And with that, I do have contact information at the end of the presentation. So if you need anything, feel free to reach out to me on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Sal. That was very informative. And I'm going to touch back on both of these presentations here at the end of the session today. We do have a quick poll for you to take before we transition into our next session. And Mark's going to put that up on the screen. If you would kindly participate in that, we would appreciate it. Can everyone see the poll? All right, thank you. For those of you who participated, I'm going to put the answers up on the screen, and Sal, you can go over the questions.
Okay, sure. Do you need a NJDEP water use permit to use a well for agriculture if you can pump 70 gallons per minute? The answer is yes. Most people got that. But basically what the question's getting at is, yes, that 70 gallons per minute threshold is where those registrations and certifications kick in.
And it also kicks in if you have more than one well and their combined output is capable of pumping more than 70, correct?
Right. So it's your total on a given farm. It's the total amount of water you can pump that's used for agricultural purposes.
Okay, thank you. Question 2.
Who is involved with getting a water use registration or certificate? I believe the correct answer would be all the above. As I mentioned, the primary regulatory agency is DEP, but the county agricultural agent, who is part of Rutgers Cooperative Extension, is also involved, and indirectly the well driller as well.
And the last question.
3, who can regulate the potable water used on your farm for farm laborers? Most people did answer all the above, and yes, potable water can involve several regulatory agencies in the state, including the DEP, county or local health departments. The Department of Labor is probably the primary regulating agency for farm workers, and the Department of Community Affairs for the state can also be involved if there's complaints and so on.
All right, thank you very much, Sal.
Thanks,
Class,
you're welcome.
do you have any questions you want to ask Sal before we switch out our speakers and start our next session? You can put those directly into the chat. If you have any specific questions about water registration or water certificates, you're more than welcome to touch base with Sal or myself. We do them on a regular basis. And both Sal and Meredith's presentations that were given tonight are in your module so that you can go back and review those slides if you would like to.
And all the links should be active there too.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.